Hello guys, welcome to a new chapter of Empress Dowager Cixi. This will be chapter 3. Emperor Xianfeng dies, 1860 to 1861. Just before he fled to the hunting lodge, Emperor Xianfeng ordered his younger half-brother, Prince Gong, to remain in the capital and to deal with the invaders. Prince Gong, 27 years old at the time, was the sixth son of their father, the one who had specifically been ruled out as successor to the throne because of his lack of visceral hatred for Westerners and his tendency to accommodate. Now, thanks to these qualities, he quickly settled with the Allies by accepting all their demands, including paying indemnities of 8 million taels of silver to each European country. The Treaty of Beijing with Britain was signed on 24th of October 1860, and the treaty with France the following day. The Allies left and peace was restored. Western powers began to install their representatives in Beijing, where they dealt with Prince Gong. The prince, pockmarked like most men of his time who had caught smallpox in childhood, was nothing less good-looking. John Thompson, the celebrated photographer who later took photos of him, said that Prince Gong had what phrenologists would describe as a splendid head. His eyes were penetrating, and his face, when in repose, wore an expression of solemn resolution. When he sat, it was in the posture dictated for Manchu aristocrats. Legs slightly apart and feet positioned at 10 past 10. His robe embroidered with dragons in gold thread, his hat adorned with a plume in a jade holder with a colored button that denoted his rank. He was the picture of a high prince. Whenever he held up his long-handled pipe, a flame would appear instantly at its tiny bejeweled bowl, struck by an attendant dropping on one knee. The prince's pipe was held in his lime-black satin boot in an inside compartment, the gentleman's pocket in those days. These pockets held a variety of items, from tobacco to state papers and from sweets to pieces of tissue with which they dine out, and chopsticks as well in some cases. The prince's chopstick case and a profusion of bejeweled objects, including a fan case, dangled from his girdle. When he travelled in the capital, his sedan chair would be under a canopy, surrounded by a showy entourage on horseback. All traffic would make way for him. Nearer his destination, a horseman would ride ahead and alert people to his imminent arrival, so they would line up to greet him. Prince Gong's half-brother, the Emperor, enjoined that, as a great prince, he must not lower himself by receiving the Europeans in person, even though they were the victors. But the prince was practical and knew his brother's order was unrealistic. He signed the treaties himself with the British and French, even arriving at the venue early to await for Lord Elgin. When Elgin arrived with an escort of 400 infantry, 100 cavalry and 2 bands playing at the head of the procession, Prince Gong advanced to greet him with his hands close together in front of his chest, a gesture that he would use with an equal. Lord Elgin, according to General Grant, returned him a proud, contemptuous look, and merely bowed slightly, which must have been the blood-run cold in poor Gong's veins. He was a delicate, gentleman-like looking man. Elgin soon toned down his show of hauteur. Both of the national representatives appeared willingly to treat each other as equals, but not as superiors. Prince Gong's conciliatoriness won him sympathy from the Europeans. Elgin wrote a friendly letter of farewell when he departed, in which he expressed the wish that future foreign affairs in China will be put in the hands of Prince Gong. Emperor Xianfeng authorized the treaties, telling Prince Gong he had done well. The emperor then had the treaties announced throughout the empire by sending them to all provinces and having posters put up in Beijing. Those who are thinking of taking advantage of the war to start a revolt will now think twice when they know peace has been restored, he said. One diarist saw the notice and wept. The Chinese emperor was listed on an equal footing with the British and French monarchs, which the man regarded as an utterly unheard of thing ever, and an unbelievable fall in our status. The country that gained most from the war was a third party, Russia, China's neighbor to the north. On the 14th of November, Prince Gong signed a treaty with the Russian envoy Nicholas Ignatieff, which ceded to Russia hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of territory north of the Amur River and east of the Ussuri, defining the border to this day. This area, which was commonly held to be a great wilderness, had been surrendered to Russia back in 1858 by the Manchu garrison chief of the territory, General Ji San, apparently in a moment of panic when the Russians were making warlike noises. The general had in fact proven himself a lying and hopeless coward during the Opium War. Consisting of 3 paragraphs and filling less than a page, the document was never endorsed by Prince Xianfeng. But now this highly irregular piece of paper was accredited by Prince Gong, who had its contents incorporated in the Treaty of Beijing with Russia. Nicholas Ignatieff claimed to the prince that it was he who had persuaded the British and French to accept a peaceful settlement and that his country therefore deserved to be rewarded. Prince Gong told the emperor that Ignatieff did nothing of the sort. In fact, he had nudged the British and the French to invade, and now he was only taking advantage of their presence in Beijing to exact what he wants. But regarding Ignatieff, as an exceedingly cunning and immovable character, the prince was worried that he would make mischief and stir up unpredictable troubles with the Allies, and so he counseled accepting his demands. Emperor Xianfeng cursed Ignatieff, calling him the most loathsome, but gave his consent, even though it is hard to imagine what trouble could have been stirred up given that the Allies were impatient to go home, and so the Qing dynasty suffered the biggest loss of territory in its history. With this treaty in his pocket, writes Nicholas' great-grandson Mikhail, Ignatieff and his Cossacks saddled up for Petersburg and, having traversed the whole of Asia on horseback in 6 weeks, he was received by the Tsar, decorated with the Order of St. Vladimir, promoted to general, and shortly thereafter made head of the Asian Department of the Foreign Office. Without firing a shot, he had secured for Russia a wild terrain the size of France and Germany combined, and the hinterland of Vladivostok, the new empire's port on the Pacific. The fact that Prince Gong yielded without a fight indicates a lack of nerve in his character, which his father had foreseen, and which was to manifest itself in other critical circumstances. As for Emperor Xianfeng, his preoccupation at the time was how to avoid an audience with the Western envoys in Beijing, who had been asking to present their credentials to him. He found the prospect of being face to face with his enemies unbearable, and told Prince Gong to refuse their request, in such a way that the issue would never rise again. Otherwise, the emperor threatened somewhat petulantly, "If I get back to Beijing and they come and ask again, I will hold you responsible and punish you." Prince Gong argued that the Europeans had no malevolent designs, but the emperor was adamant. Lord Elgin had carried to China on his 2 trips in 1858 and 1860 handwritten letters from Queen Victoria to Emperor Xianfeng professing goodwill. Those letters were brought back to Britain undelivered and unopened. In the north, in the hunting lodge beyond the Great Wall, Emperor Xianfeng maintained contact with Prince Gong in Beijing and continued his administrative routine, dealing with dozens of reports from all over the empire each day. The documents were delivered through an ancient but efficient system, with messengers riding on horses whose speed was specified depending on the urgency of the message. The most urgent took 2 days to arrive from Beijing. At first, the emperor was keen to return to the capital once the British and the French had pulled out. The weather at the lodge was getting very cold, and worse with each passing day. Having not been inhabited for decades, the palace was not equipped with the necessary things to cope with the severe winter. But then he hesitated. Several times after announcing that he was departing, he cancelled the trip. Officials urged him to go, anxiously pointing out that the country risk instability if the emperor was not on the throne in the capital. But the argument did not move the monarch, nor did the thought of his own health. He finally chose to spend the green winter in the northern wilderness, knowing it was bad for his delicate physique. The emperor, it appears, was determined not to be in the same city as the western legations. He seems to have been living out the Chinese idea of ultimate hatred, not under the same sky, Bu Gong Dai Tian, or he could not bear being near the ravaged old summer palace. His self-imposed exile was prolonged and became permanent. Spending the interminable harsh winter in the ill-equipped hunting lodge, he fell ill, coughed blood, and 11 months after arriving on 22nd August 1861, he died. In the last months of his life, although he still dealt with state matters diligently, stopping working only on the days he was confined to bed. He no longer wrote the same kind of detailed instructions as before, and he allowed himself to indulge in his real passions, opera and other musics, which were performed almost every day. The performers had been summoned from Beijing to the lodge as soon as he had settled there, and the moment they arrived they had been rushed to him, given no time to change into their costumes. Well over 200 singers, dancers and musicians eventually crowded the lodge, and the place ran out of habitable rooms. The emperor spent a lot of time with them, selecting the repertoires and picking the cast, watching rehearsals and arguing with the performers about interpretations. He listened to the singing of music that he himself had composed. The performances, which usually lasted for hours, were sometimes staged on an islet in the middle of a lake, in a courtyard theatre poetically named as A Touch of Cloud. At other times, they were held in the quarters where he lived, or where Cixi and their young son lived. In the last 16 days of his life, the emperor watched operas on 11 days, each day for several hours. 2 days before he died, he listened to opera from 1:45 to 6:55 p.m., with a break of only 27 minutes. The next day's scheduled performance had to be cancelled. The emperor was feeling extremely sick, and then he lost consciousness. When he became conscious again that night, Xianfen summoned to his bedside the men closest to him, his old inner circle, 8 princes and ministers, and announced his will to them. His only son by Cixi, now 5 years old, will be the next emperor, and the 8 men were to form a board of regents, to be jointly in charge. They asked him to write the will down in his own hand in crimson ink to give its unquestioned authority, but he was unable to hold the brush. So one of the men wrote it for him, making it clear that this had been the emperor's wish. Emperor Xianfen died a few hours later. With these men by his side, China was now in the hands of the regents. These were the same men who had ordered the capture and abuse of Elgin's messengers, which had resulted in some of them dying horribly, and had led to the burning of the old summer palace. These were the same men who had helped Emperor Xianfen make all his disastrous decisions, which ended with his own death. Cixi could see that with these men in charge, stumbling along the same self-destructive road, there would be no end to catastrophe, which promised to destroy her son as well as the empire. She made up her mind to act by launching a coup and resisting the power from the regents.